The evening sky turned golden as the sun began to set over Washington, D.C. The city hummed with the usual end-of-day traffic, government workers heading home after long hours serving the country. Among them was Chief Justice Thomas Reynolds, driving his navy blue sedan through the tree-lined streets. Tired but satisfied after a day of important work at the Supreme Court. At 58 years old, Reynolds had broken barriers as the first black Chief Justice of the United States. His journey hadn't been easy. Born to working-class parents in Detroit, he had fought for every opportunity, pushing past the doubts and prejudice that tried to block his path. Now, after 3 years as Chief Justice and decades as a respected judge and scholar, he had earned his place in American history. Reynolds loosened his tie as he drove, thinking about the major case the court had discussed that day. The justices had debated for hours, and while they disagreed on many points, Reynolds was proud of how they had listened to each other with respect. That's what made the court work, different minds coming together, guided by the Constitution rather than politics. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Dinner in the oven. Don't be late." Reynolds smiled, grateful for her support through all these years. They had met in law school, both of them dreaming of making a difference. While he had taken the path to the bench, she had built a successful career helping low-income families with legal aid. Their shared commitment to justice had kept them strong through the challenges they'd faced. As Reynolds turned into the wealthy Georgetown neighborhood where they lived, he noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. The car had been following him for several blocks now. Reynolds checked his speed, exactly at the limit. His turn signals worked fine. The car was in perfect condition. There was no reason to be pulled over. Yet the familiar feeling came anyway, that tightness in his chest, the automatic mental checklist. Reynolds turned down the classical music playing softly on his radio. He sat up straighter in his seat. Old habits from decades of driving, while black didn't disappear, even when you reached the highest court in the land. It's nothing, he told himself, just a cop heading the same way. But the cruiser stayed close behind him. Too close. Reynolds remembered the talk he'd given his son when he turned 16 and got his license. Keep your hands visible. Don't make sudden movements. Be polite, no matter what. Stay calm. It broke his heart that such instructions were necessary, but they were. They could save lives. The police car's lights suddenly flashed blue and red, the signal unmistakable. Reynolds felt his heart rate jump despite himself. 3 decades in the legal profession, countless honors and achievements, and still this moment brought back every uncomfortable encounter with law enforcement he'd experienced since childhood. He pulled over carefully, positioning his car properly at the curb. Through his mirror, he watched the officer sit in the cruiser for a long moment, presumably running his plates. Reynolds knew what would come up. His car registered to his home address in this very neighborhood. Nothing suspicious, nothing wrong. He took a deep breath and followed the protocol he knew by heart. Interior light on so the officer could see clearly inside the car. Engine off. Hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel where they would be visible. Window rolled down. Wait calmly. In his wallet was his driver's license, insurance card, and tucked behind them, his Supreme Court identification. In his glove compartment were the car's registration and other documents. But Reynolds didn't reach for any of them yet. He knew better than to make any movements until instructed. As the officer finally opened his door and approached, Reynolds noticed a man walking his dog across the street slow down, watching the scene with interest. A woman on her porch next door had also stopped watering her flowers, her attention now on the traffic stop. Reynolds took another deep breath. This would be quick, he told himself. A routine stop, nothing to worry about. He had no way of knowing how wrong he was. Officer Richard Wilson had been with the Georgetown Police Department for 12 years. He started his shift like any other day, with a quick coffee and a briefing from the sergeant about recent break-ins reported in the upscale neighborhoods. Keep an eye out for suspicious vehicles, the sergeant had said. Wilson took those words to heart. Behind the wheel of his cruiser, Wilson felt a sense of power and responsibility. The residents of these wealthy streets depended on him to keep them safe. At least that's what he told himself. What he didn't say aloud was how he decided what looked suspicious to him. His record spoke for itself, 17 civilian complaints in his file, most from black and brown drivers who claimed he had stopped them without cause. Each complaint had been reviewed and dismissed by the department. Just people trying to get out of tickets, his supervisor would say. Wilson spotted the navy blue sedan turning into the Oak Hill subdivision, one of the most expensive in the district. The car was clean, not speeding, nothing visibly wrong with it. But the driver was a black man, and to Wilson, that didn't fit the neighborhood. What's he doing here? Wilson muttered to himself following the car. He didn't bother to consider that the man might live there, or be visiting family, or have any of 100 legitimate reasons to drive through. For several minutes, Wilson tailed the sedan, looking for any small violation he could use as a reason to pull it over. When none appeared, he decided to act anyway. He flipped on his lights and siren. "Let's see what we've got here," he said to himself, already imagining finding something. Drugs, a weapon, an outstanding warrant, anything to justify his suspicion. Wilson waited in his cruiser for a minute, watching as the driver properly pulled over and turned on the interior light, signs of someone who knew the routine. He ran the plates and frowned when the registration came back to an address in this very neighborhood, under the name Thomas Reynolds. The name meant nothing to Wilson. He didn't follow the news about the Supreme Court or much of anything beyond sports and local crime reports. Wilson stepped out of his cruiser, unsnapping the safety strap on his holster, something he did automatically when approaching vehicles with black drivers, but rarely with white ones. It was an unconscious bias he never acknowledged, even to himself. He approached with caution, hand resting near his weapon, watching the driver's hands on the steering wheel. "License and registration," Wilson demanded, not bothering to introduce himself or explain the reason for the stop. His voice was sharp with authority. He stood slightly behind the driver's window, positioned to see inside while staying partially shielded. "Good evening, officer," the driver replied calmly. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The simple, reasonable question triggered something in Wilson. In his mind, people who asked questions were being difficult, challenging his authority. He didn't like being questioned, especially by someone he had already decided didn't belong. "Step out of the vehicle," Wilson ordered, his hand now moving to grip his weapon. "Officer, I'd be happy to comply, but I'd like to know the reason for this stop," the driver insisted, still calm but firm. Wilson's face flushed with anger. Who did this guy think he was? He unholstered his weapon and raised it, pointing it directly at the driver. "I said, step out of the vehicle. Now." Across the street, a neighbor who had been walking in from collecting his mail froze at the sight of the drawn weapon. The man quietly pulled out his phone and began recording. 2 houses down, a woman stepped onto her porch, attracted by the sound of raised voices. The driver of the sedan slowly raised his hands higher on the steering wheel, making sure they remained visible. His expression remained remarkably composed, though his eyes reflected a deep wariness, the look of a man who had been here before, too many times. "I'm going to reach for the door handle very slowly," he said, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at him. "I want to comply with your instructions, officer." Wilson's hand trembled slightly, the weight of the gun suddenly feeling heavier than usual. Something about the dignified way the man spoke gave him pause, but he wouldn't back down now. "Do it slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." The evening had started so normally. Now, in the fading light of day, a routine traffic stop based on nothing but prejudice was about to change many lives forever. Chief Justice Reynolds slowly reached for the door handle, his movements deliberate and careful. The gun remained pointed at him, Officer Wilson's finger uncomfortably close to the trigger. As Reynolds opened the door, the interior light cast shadows across both men's faces, highlighting the tension between them. "Step out and keep your hands where I can see them," Wilson ordered, taking a small step back to maintain what he considered a safe distance. Reynolds complied, emerging from the car with dignity despite the humiliating situation. He stood tall, not in defiance, but with the natural bearing of a man accustomed to commanding respect in courtrooms across the nation. His suit was expensive but understated, his tie loosened after the long day. "Now place your hands on the roof of the vehicle," Wilson demanded. "Officer," Reynolds said calmly, "I'd still like to know why I've been stopped. I wasn't speeding. My car is in proper condition. All my documentation is current." Wilson's grip on his weapon tightened. "I don't need to explain myself to you. This is a routine traffic stop. Now put your hands on the vehicle before I have to take further action. The neighbor across the street had moved closer, his phone recording steadily. Another car slowed as it passed, the driver watching with concern. The evening air felt charged with tension, every word between the two men carrying weight. Reynolds placed his hands on the roof of his sedan as instructed. "Officer, my wallet is in my inside jacket pocket. My identification and registration are all in order. May I reach for them?" "Don't move," Wilson snapped, stepping forward to pat down Reynolds' pockets, his gun still drawn. The Chief Justice remained perfectly still, his face a mask of control despite the indignity. He had learned long ago that showing anger in these situations could be deadly. As Wilson roughly checked Reynolds' pockets, a leather wallet fell to the ground. It opened as it hit the pavement, and a gold-embossed identification card slid out, glinting in the beam of Wilson's flashlight. "My credentials," Reynolds explained quietly. "I'm on my way home from work." Wilson bent down to pick up the wallet, his gun still trained on Reynolds. As he glanced at the ID card, his expression changed. The official Supreme Court identification showed Reynolds' photograph alongside his title, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. For several long seconds, Wilson seemed unable to process what he was seeing. His hand holding the gun wavered slightly. "You're the Chief Justice?" Wilson's voice had lost its edge of authority, replaced by disbelief. "Yes, officer, I am," Reynolds replied evenly. "Now, would you please lower your weapon? There's no need for it to be pointed at me." Wilson didn't move immediately. Part of him couldn't reconcile the man he had suspected of wrongdoing with the highest-ranking judicial officer in the country. Another part, a part he wasn't proud of, was searching for a way to justify his actions. "I live 3 houses down," Reynolds continued, nodding toward a stately home visible from where they stood. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 5 years." By now, several more neighbors had emerged from their homes. Mrs. Chen from next door had walked to the edge of her lawn, concern evident on her face as she called out, "Is everything all right, Justice Reynolds?" The familiar way the neighbor addressed him seemed to finally convince Wilson. Slowly he lowered his weapon, though he didn't holster it yet. There have been reports of suspicious activity in the area," Wilson stammered, searching for justification. "I was just doing my job." "Your job includes pointing your weapon at unarmed citizens who've committed no crime?" Reynolds asked, his voice still measured but with an undercurrent of authority that had decided landmark cases. Wilson finally holstered his weapon, the reality of what he had done beginning to dawn on him. He handed Reynolds back his wallet with a noticeable tremble in his hand. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, sir," he said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. Reynolds straightened his suit jacket, taking a moment to collect himself. "Officer Wilson," he said, reading the name tag, "I don't think this was a misunderstanding at all. And I think we both know it." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been. Around them, phones continued recording, capturing a moment that would soon be seen by millions across the country. The streetlights had fully come on now, casting both men in harsh yellow light. Officer Wilson stood frozen, Supreme Court ID still in his hand, the weight of his mistake sinking in. Chief Justice Reynolds remained calm, though anyone who knew him well would have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, a sign of carefully controlled anger. Wilson started, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in his career, he found himself at a complete loss for words. The script had flipped. Suddenly he was the one feeling scrutinized and judged. Reynolds extended his hand. "My identification, please." Wilson handed it back mechanically. A small crowd had gathered now, about a dozen neighbors keeping a respectful distance but watching intently. The man who had started filming had been joined by others, their phone cameras capturing every moment of the encounter. "Do you know what happens in my courtroom, Officer Wilson?" Reynolds asked, tucking his ID back into his wallet. His voice remained level, conversational almost. Wilson swallowed hard. "No, sir. Evidence matters. Facts matter. In my courtroom, I can't simply act on a feeling or a hunch. I need probable cause." Reynolds straightened his tie, a gesture that seemed to help him maintain his composure. "So I'll ask you again, what was your probable cause for pulling me over tonight?" Wilson's face flushed. The truth, that he had seen a black man driving in a wealthy neighborhood and immediately thought, doesn't belong, wasn't something he could admit, especially not to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, not with cameras recording his every word. There have been reports of break-ins in the area, he said finally, falling back on the briefing from earlier that day. And how exactly did my driving match the pattern of these break-ins? Reynolds pressed, his legal mind dissecting the officer's flimsy justification. Before Wilson could answer, a police supervisor's car pulled up, lights flashing but no siren. Word had already spread through police channels about what was happening. Captain Lee, a veteran officer with 25 years on the force, hurried toward them. "Justice Reynolds," she said, her tone respectful but concerned. "Is everything all right, sir?" "Captain," Reynolds acknowledged with a slight nod. "I was just discussing with Officer Wilson here the constitutional requirements for a traffic stop. The Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable search and seizure, specifically." Captain Lee shot a sharp look at Wilson, quickly assessing the situation. "Officer, what happened here?" Wilson looked between his superior and the Chief Justice, realizing fully now how serious this had become. "I initiated a traffic stop and," he hesitated, "there was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding that involved drawing your weapon on an unarmed citizen," Reynolds added quietly. Captain Lee's eyes widened. "Your weapon was drawn." One of the neighbors called out, "We all saw it. He had his gun pointed right at him." "I have it on video," shouted another. Captain Lee turned to Wilson, her expression hardening. "Secure your weapon in your vehicle and wait for me there. Now." As Wilson walked stiffly back to his cruiser, Captain Lee turned to Reynolds. "Sir, I can't begin to express how sorry I am for this incident. This is not how our officers are trained to conduct themselves." Reynolds looked thoughtfully at the departing officer, then back to the captain. "Perhaps that's something worth examining more closely, Captain. Because in my experience, this is exactly how too many officers conduct themselves when encountering people who look like me." Captain Lee didn't have an immediate answer for that. She knew he was right. "I'd like to go home now," Reynolds said, gesturing toward his house down the street. "My wife will be wondering what's happened to me." "Of course, sir," Captain Lee nodded. "But we will need a statement about this incident." Reynolds looked around at the neighbors with their phones, at the police cars now lining the street, at Officer Wilson sitting dejectedly in his cruiser. "I think this incident will speak for itself," he said. "And Captain, I hope you understand. I won't be using my position to either expedite or impede whatever process follows. This should be handled exactly as it would be if I were any other citizen facing the same situation." As he walked back to his car to drive the short distance home, Reynolds knew this was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. By morning, the video had spread like wildfire across social media. Chief Justice Reynolds having a gun pointed at him by a police officer in front of his own home was more than just a local incident. It had become a national talking point. Reynolds sat in his kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him as he scrolled through the news on his tablet. His wife Pat placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You haven't touched your breakfast," she said softly. Reynolds set down the tablet with a sigh. "I knew this would blow up, but not quite like this." Every major news network was running the story. Headlines screamed across screens nationwide. Supreme Court Chief Justice held at gunpoint by police. Top judge racially profiled in his own neighborhood. Justice for justice. Police officer pulls gun on highest judge in the land. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Calls from fellow justices, from the president, from civil rights leaders, from reporters, all wanting a statement, all wanting to know what he planned to do next. "The department called again," Pat said, sitting down beside him. "The police chief wants to meet with you personally to apologize." Reynolds nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. After 30 years in law, he had developed the ability to see every angle of a situation, to consider all possible outcomes. This incident wasn't just about him, it was about every black person who had ever been stopped without cause, who had faced excessive force, who had felt that spike of fear when blue lights flashed in their rearview mirror. "I need to be careful here," he said finally. "Whatever I do sets a precedent." Pat squeezed his hand. "You always do what's right, Thomas. That's why you're where you are." The doorbell rang, interrupting their moment of quiet. Reynolds' security detail, increased since the incident, checked the visitor before allowing Professor Lin, their neighbor and friend, into the kitchen. "The press is camped at the end of the street," Lin said, accepting the coffee Pat offered. "I counted at least 7 news vans." Lin placed his phone on the table, showing Reynolds footage he hadn't seen yet, shot from a different angle, showing clearly how Officer Wilson had approached with his hand already on his weapon, how quickly the situation had escalated. "My son uploaded it last night," Lin explained. "He was the one walking our dog when it happened." Reynolds watched the video silently. Seeing it from an outside perspective was different from living it. The footage showed something he hadn't fully registered in the moment: the fear in Wilson's eyes. Not just after the recognition, but before it. The officer had been afraid of him, a 58-year-old man in a business suit. "The police department issued a statement an hour ago," Lin continued. "Officer Wilson has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation." Reynolds nodded, unsurprised. "Standard procedure." "People are calling for his badge," Lin said. "Civil rights groups are organizing protests for this weekend. They're saying this is the perfect case to push for police reform, the ultimate example that no black person is safe from profiling, not even the highest judge in the country." Reynolds rubbed his temples. The weight of responsibility was settling on him, heavier than the judicial robes he wore in court. Whatever he said or did next would affect not just Officer Wilson's future, but potentially policing policies nationwide. His phone buzzed with a text from his son. "Dad, you okay? Seen you all over the news. Call me." That message hit him harder than all the news coverage. His son was worried, and with good reason. Reynolds had given him the talk years ago: how to behave if stopped by police, how to make it home safely. Now his son was watching his own father face exactly what they had discussed so many times. "I need to make a statement," Reynolds decided finally. Not as Chief Justice, but as a citizen who happened to have cameras present for what too many experience with no witnesses. Pat looked concerned. "The court has always stayed above politics. Your position." "This isn't politics," Reynolds interrupted gently. "This is humanity. And sometimes silence is a political choice too." As if to underscore his point, his phone lit up with another call, the White House again. The president wanted his input on a speech addressing the incident. The personal had become national. A routine drive home had turned into a moment that might change the country. 3 days after the incident, Chief Justice Reynolds stood at a podium in the Supreme Court press room. This was unprecedented. Justices rarely held press conferences, especially about personal matters. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as he approached the microphone. Reynolds had chosen to wear a simple dark suit rather than his judicial robes. Today he wasn't speaking as Chief Justice, but as a man who had experienced something all too common in the lives of black Americans. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice steady. "I thought carefully about whether to address what happened to me on Tuesday evening. The tradition of this court is to speak through our rulings, not through the press." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "But there are moments when silence serves no one. This is one of those moments." Outside the Supreme Court building, crowds had gathered. People held signs reading "Justice for All" and "Even judges aren't safe." Police kept a respectful distance, their presence minimal but vigilant. "What happened to me has happened to countless Americans," Reynolds continued. "The only difference is that in my case, there were witnesses, videos, and my position gave the incident national attention." He then did something no one expected. He shared personal stories, not just about the recent incident, but about a lifetime of similar experiences. "When I was a law student at Harvard, security stopped me while I was studying late in the library, assuming I didn't belong there. When I was a federal judge, I was mistaken for a defendant while entering my own courtroom. Last year, a store clerk followed me around an upscale shop while I was buying a gift for my wife." The room was completely silent now, reporters forgetting to take notes as they listened. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern that many Americans experience daily. The robe I wear in this building doesn't shield me from prejudice when I take it off. Back at the police department, Officer Wilson watched the press conference on a small TV in the break room. He was still on administrative leave, facing an internal investigation and possibly worse. The police union had offered him legal representation, but public opinion had turned strongly against him. "What I'm asking for isn't special treatment," Reynolds said on screen. "I'm asking for equal treatment, for a country where a person isn't suspicious simply because of the color of their skin." Wilson turned away, unable to watch anymore. The reality of what he had done, and why he had done it, was sinking in. No matter how he tried to justify his actions, he knew the truth. He had stopped Reynolds because he was black, nothing more. Across town, Pat Reynolds watched her husband with pride tinged with worry. She knew the risks he was taking. Supreme Court justices weren't supposed to wade into political waters. Critics would say he was compromising his impartiality, that cases involving police conduct might now come before a biased judge. "I believe in our system of justice," Reynolds continued at the podium. "I've devoted my life to it. But systems are made of people, and people can change. We must examine the biases that affect our judgments, from the street to the highest court in the land." In living rooms across America, families watched together, conversations starting that had been avoided for too long. In police academies, instructors paused their lessons to let cadets listen. In the White House, the president and his advisors discussed a new policing reform bill that had been stalled in Congress. "I don't seek punishment for the officer involved," Reynolds said, nearing the end of his address. "I seek understanding and change. The question isn't what happens to one officer, but what happens to our country. Will we have the courage to look at ourselves honestly? Will we have the wisdom to do better?" As Reynolds stepped away from the podium, declining to take questions, the impact of his words was already spreading. Hashtags trended. Commentators debated. Politicians issued statements. But most importantly, people talked to each other, sometimes uncomfortably, sometimes with tears, but they talked. About race, about policing, about justice, about what kind of country they wanted to live in. A simple traffic stop had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. 6 months had passed since that evening when blue lights flashed behind Chief Justice Reynolds' car. The seasons had changed, leaves fallen and grown again, but the conversation sparked by the incident hadn't faded. Today, Reynolds sat in his chambers, reviewing briefs for an upcoming case. Police qualified immunity was on the docket, a legal doctrine that protected officers from personal liability in civil rights lawsuits. The case had been working its way through the courts for years, but now it carried extra weight. His clerk knocked gently on the door. "They're ready for you, sir." Reynolds nodded, gathering his notes. As he walked through the marble hallways of the Supreme Court, he thought about how to separate his personal experience from his judicial duty. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The law had to be applied fairly, regardless of personal feelings. Across town, Officer Wilson was back on duty, but things were different. After 3 months of administrative leave, mandatory bias training, and community service hours, he had returned to find a changed department. New policies had been implemented. Body cameras were now required for all stops. Regular training sessions addressed unconscious bias. Officers were paired with community members for ride-alongs to build better relationships. Wilson himself had changed too. The incident had forced him to look hard at his assumptions, at the way he policed different neighborhoods. He still struggled with it sometimes, catching himself making quick judgments based on appearance. But now he recognized those thoughts and questioned them. Today, he was headed to a community center after his shift. The department had started a youth mentoring program, pairing officers with local teens. It wasn't always comfortable. Many of the kids were openly suspicious of police, but it was a start. At the Supreme Court, Reynolds took his seat at the center of the bench. The courtroom fell silent as the justices prepared to hear arguments. This case would set precedent for years to come on how police could be held accountable for their actions. "Oyez, oyez, oyez," the court crier called, beginning the formal opening. "All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention." Reynolds listened carefully as lawyers presented their arguments. One side argued that qualified immunity was necessary to allow police to make split-second decisions without fear of lawsuits. The other contended that the doctrine had become a shield that prevented accountability for clear misconduct. When it was his turn to ask questions, Reynolds was fair but pointed. How do we balance the need for officers to perform their duties without constant fear of litigation against the citizens' right to redress when those officers clearly exceed their authority? He asked. The question cut to the heart of the issue. It wasn't about punishing all police or protecting them at all costs. It was about finding that difficult middle ground where justice was served for everyone. Later that evening, Reynolds received an unexpected request. Officer Wilson had written to ask if the Chief Justice would meet with him privately. After careful consideration, Reynolds agreed. They met in a small conference room at the courthouse, just the two of them. Neither man was entirely comfortable, but both recognized the importance of the conversation. "I wanted to thank you," Wilson said finally, breaking an awkward silence. "Not for forgiving me. I know you haven't, but for not destroying me. You could have demanded my badge." Reynolds studied him thoughtfully. "Taking your job wouldn't solve the larger problem. And believe it or not, I think you might do more good wearing that badge, having learned what you've learned." "I think about that night every day," Wilson admitted. "I keep asking myself why I really pulled you over." "And what answer have you come to?" Reynolds asked. Wilson looked down at his hands. "The honest one. The one I didn't want to admit, even to myself." They talked for nearly an hour, not as Chief Justice and officer, but as two men trying to understand each other. They didn't become friends. Too much stood between them for that, but they found something valuable: perspective. As Wilson left, Reynolds returned to his chambers to finish his opinion on the qualified immunity case. Whatever the court decided would affect policing across the country for years to come. The weight of that responsibility was enormous. But as he wrote, Reynolds felt cautiously hopeful. Real change happens slowly, painfully, in fits and starts. But it did happen, one conversation, one policy, one ruling at a time.